The hill country south of Jerusalem, in the late 11th century before Christ, was quieter than the Hebrew Bible sometimes suggests. Bethlehem, perched on a limestone ridge about 8 kilometers south of the Jebusite stronghold that would one day become Jerusalem, was a small agricultural settlement of a few hundred inhabitants, surrounded by terraces of grain, olives and grapevines. In the archaeological strata of Iron Age Uas, roughly 1050 to 1000 before Christ, it would have left almost no record at all, if not for the man whose name became attached to it forever. No monumental buildings, no royal inscriptions, just hills, sheep, and the long shadow of the first king Israel had ever crowned. A man named Saul, whose reign was already unraveling about a day's walk to the north, to understand why a prophet from Ramah would arrive in Bethlehem with a horn of oil hidden in a sacrificial errand. You have to start with how Saul lost the throne before he had finished sitting on it. He had been chosen at the demand of the elders of Israel, who pressed the aging Samuel for a king like the nations around them. For a time, he delivered. He broke the Ammonite siege at Jabesh Gilead and rallied Israel against the Philistines. But 2 episodes broke him. The first was at Gilgal, where, pressed by a Philistine army at Michmash, and watching his men desert, Saul offered the burnt sacrifice himself, instead of waiting the 7 days Samuel had commanded. Samuel arrived, found the smoke still rising, and in 1 Samuel 13 verses 13 and 14 delivered the verdict. You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. It is the first time. The Hebrew Bible uses the phrase that would shadow David for 3,000 years. A man after his own heart. Saul did not yet know it pointed to a child, not yet a soldier, herding sheep south of the future capital. The second episode was the Amalekite War. Saul was commanded to carry out a total ban on the desert raiders who had ambushed Israel at the Exodus. But he executed the campaign and spared the Amalekite king Agag and the best of the livestock. Samuel confronted him at Gilgal a second time. In 1 Samuel 15 verses 22 and 23, the prophet says, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Saul would rule for years more, but the Spirit would leave him, and somewhere south of where he stood, the man who would replace him was already alive. The 16th chapter of 1 Samuel opens with Samuel grieving, and the Lord telling him to stop. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 1, the Lord says, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Samuel objects on practical grounds. Saul, paranoid and hardening, would hear of the journey and have him killed. Yahweh gives him a cover. Take a heifer to Bethlehem, announce a sacrifice, invite Jesse and his sons, and the rest would be revealed in the moment. The walk was about 30 kilometers south through Iron Age wooden terrain excavated at sites like Ai, Kirbet Radana, and Bethel, small terraced villages with 4-room houses and collared rim jars, the material culture of a society barely emerging from chiefdom into kingdom. When Samuel arrived, the elders of Bethlehem trembled. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 4, they ask him, "Do you come in peace?" The trembling was political. A prophet with a horn of oil moving without the king's blessing was, in that century, indistinguishable from a coup. Samuel calmed them, consecrated Jesse and his sons, and the procession of inspection began. Eliab, the eldest, came first, tall, the kind of man whose shoulders fill a doorway. Samuel, who had once anointed Saul because Saul stood a head taller than any other man in Israel, looked at Eliab and assumed he had found the new king. The correction in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 has become one of the most quoted lines in the Hebrew Bible. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, 7 sons of Jesse passed before Samuel: Abinadab, Shammah, 4 others the text does not name. Each was rejected. Samuel finally asked Jesse whether these were all the sons he had. Jesse answered that the youngest was in the field with the sheep. The Hebrew word for the youngest, katon, carries the sense of the insignificant one, the one not even worth bringing to a priestly meal. That Jesse had left him in the pasture is itself a comment on how the family ranked him. Samuel ordered him sent for, and the procession halted. No one sat down to eat until the boy arrived. He came in from the hills. The text in 1 Samuel 16 verse 12 describes him in 3 quick phrases. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. The Hebrew word translated glowing with health is admoni, ruddy, the same root that lies behind the name of Edom. He was a teenager, probably between 13 and 17 by the standards of how shepherds were assigned in the ancient Levant. Samuel heard the Lord say in the same verse, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." The prophet poured the oil over the boy's head while his brothers watched. The Spirit of the Lord came on David in power from that day forward, and the text does not say it ever departed. Samuel returned to Ramah. David went back to the sheep. No proclamation, no crown, no army. The most important political event of the 11th century in the Central Highlands had just happened in private, witnessed by a frightened priest, a confused father, and 7 older brothers who were about to spend the next decade watching their youngest do what none of them could have imagined. The consequences began almost at once in Saul's mind. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 14, a single sentence shifts the narrative north. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. The Hebrew is ruach ra, a harmful spirit, a darkening of mood the text attributes to Yahweh's judgment. Saul's servants suggested music as therapy. One of them remembered a boy, a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. The recommendation in 1 Samuel 16 verse 18 lists 5 things about him in one breath. He plays well. He is a brave warrior. He speaks well. He is fine-looking. And the Lord is with him. It is the entire David in 5 clauses before the boy has done anything in public. Saul sent for him. Jesse loaded a donkey with bread, wine, and a young goat, and dispatched his youngest as armor-bearer to the king who had just been rejected on his behalf. The boy arrived at Saul's stronghold at Gibeah, almost certainly the site excavated as Tel El Ful on the Aek northern outskirts of modern Jerusalem, where archaeologists have uncovered a small fortified citadel datable to Iron Age weighings, and stood in the presence of the king he was destined to replace. Saul, the text says, loved him greatly. The boy played the harp when the dark spirit came, and the king, for a time, was calmed. The historical question of David's existence is no longer open. A basalt fragment discovered in 1993 at Tel Dan, in the Upper Galilee, bears an Aramaic inscription in which a king of Aram Damascus, almost certainly Hazael, boasts in the late 9th century before Christ of killing kings of the house of David and the house of Israel. It places David about 150 years after his death as the founder of a dynasty recognized by his enemies. Israel Finkelstein has argued that the biblical David is a vastly inflated literary construction, while Amihai Mazar and others have countered that the textual core, the Iron IEA fortifications at sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa, and the dynastic memory at Tel Dan point to a real chieftain whose 10th century kingdom was modest in extent, but historical in foundation. By the standards of Iron Age archaeology, the shepherd in the field is the best attested early Israelite king we possess. And in the year Samuel poured the oil, none of that mattered yet. The boy returned to the sheep when the king did not need him, walked back into the hills outside Bethlehem, and waited. The Spirit had come on him. The horn had been emptied. The kingdom had begun to change hands, and not a single person in Israel north of the Bethlehem Ridge knew it. Some years passed. The boy who had played the harp at Gibeah returned to Bethlehem when the dark spirit lifted from Saul, and the king's life resumed its narrow rhythm of border skirmishes against the Philistine cities of the coast. Those cities were 5: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. The Philistine Pentapolis, organized as a confederation of Suranim, lords, who ruled the coastal plains the Israelites had never penetrated. The Philistines were not Semites. They were descendants of one of the great migrations of the late Bronze Age collapse, the Sea Peoples whose movements are recorded in the temple reliefs of Medinet Habu, where the pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1175 before Christ, depicts himself driving back ships and chariots filled with men in feathered helmets. The same iconography that survives on the painted pottery of Ashkelon and Ekron. By the time Saul reigned, 3 or 4 generations after that arrival, the Philistine cities were the most heavily armed political centers in the southern Levant. They controlled iron, the working of which the Hebrew Bible explicitly attributes to them in 1 Samuel 13, where the text says no blacksmith could be found in the whole of Israel. The geography that mattered for the encounter that would define David was a narrow valley about 35 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem, called the Valley of Elah. It runs east to west between the Judean foothills and the coastal plain, a natural corridor of incursion. The Philistines, pushing inland, took up position on one ridge near a place called Soko. Saul and Israel encamped on the opposite ridge. Between them lay the Wadi, the dry stream bed where, in the eastern foothills, recent excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa have uncovered a fortified Israelite town datable to the Iron IEA, with 2 gates and a casement wall, that the archaeologist Yosef Garfinkel has argued reflects exactly the kind of organized polity the Hebrew Bible attributes to the early monarchy. The valley's silence each morning, before the day's exchange of insults, was the silence of 2 armies who had not yet decided to fight. Into that silence, morning and evening for 40 days, walked a champion. The 17th chapter of 1 Samuel describes him in detail. His height the text gives as 6 cubits and a span, about 290 centimeters in the Masoretic text, or in the older Septuagint and a Qumran fragment, 4 cubits and a span, roughly 210 centimeters. The shorter figure, scholars like Geoffrey Tigay note, is more consistent with the skeletal remains of unusually tall ancient Levantines. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 5-7, the text catalogues his armament. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. The combination is unusual. The bronze helmet, scale corselet, and greaves are characteristic of Aegean and Anatolian warrior tradition. The panoply of Mycenae and Cyprus, surviving into the early Iron Age along the western Anatolian fringe. The iron spear point reflects the Philistine monopoly on the new metallurgy. The portrait is of a champion equipped in the Western Mediterranean style, fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean style of single combat. The man's name was Goliath, and he was from Gath, the easternmost city of the Pentapolis, identified today with the great mound of Tel Safi. His challenge followed a Mediterranean tradition. The Greek epic tradition would later preserve in the duels of the Iliad. Choose a man, send him out. Let him and Goliath decide the war between them. In 1 Samuel 17, verses 8 and 9, he calls across the valley, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." For 40 days, no man in Israel answered, including Saul, who stood a head taller than any other Israelite. The army's silence each morning was a slow erosion of the king's authority. David came down to the camp on an errand for his father. 3 of his older brothers were with the army, and Jesse, anxious for news, sent his youngest with bread, parched grain, and 10 cheeses for the commander of the brothers' regiment. He arrived as the morning challenge was being shouted across the wadi. He heard it and asked the question whose form was already accusatory. In 1 Samuel 17 verse 26 he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" His eldest brother, Eliab, hearing him, accused him of pride and curiosity. Word reached Saul that someone wanted to fight, and the boy was brought before the king. What David said to Saul in 1 Samuel 17 verses 34-37 is the closest thing the text offers to a self-portrait of the years he had spent in the hills. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul agreed and tried to dress him in the royal armor. The text in 1 Samuel 17 verse 39 records, almost dryly, that David tried to walk in it and could not, and took it off. He went down to the wadi instead with his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream bed. The sling in question was not the slingshot of children's drawings. It was a leather pouch with 2 long cords swung overhead that propelled a stone projectile at velocities modern reconstructions estimate at over 100 kilometers an hour. Trained slingers in the ancient Near East, the Benjamites of Israel, the slingers of Persia and later of Rhodes, were considered a specialist branch of light infantry alongside archers and their range and accuracy at 50 meters were lethal. 5 smooth stones from a wadi bottom, water-rounded over centuries, were ideal projectiles. David picked them by trade, not symbolically. What followed, the text recounts in 7 verses. Goliath came out, his shield-bearer ahead of him, and saw the boy. He despised him for being a youth. He cursed him by his gods. David answered him. In 1 Samuel 17 verse 45, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." He ran toward the line, reached into his bag, slung 1 stone, and struck Goliath in the forehead. The Philistine fell face down. David ran to him, drew the man's own sword from its sheath, and finished him with it. The Philistine line, watching their champion die, broke and ran toward Gath and Ekron, with Israel pursuing them down the valley as far as the gates of both cities. David carried Goliath's head to Jerusalem, the text says. A curious detail, since the city was still Jebusite and would remain so until David captured it years later. The note may reflect the editorial perspective of a scribe writing after the conquest of Jerusalem, projecting onto the moment its later identity as the City of David. The aftermath is what mattered politically. Saul, the next chapter says, would not let David go home anymore. He kept him at court, made him a commander, and sent him out on every campaign. And in 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 and 7, the women of every town in Israel came out to meet the returning army, dancing and singing a refrain that would change the rest of David's life. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The boy from the field had crossed in a single afternoon from the obscurity of a sacrificial errand to the most dangerous place in Saul's kingdom, the place just inside the king's reach. The transition was instant. The boy who had come back from the wadi with Goliath's head was no longer the boy who had carried cheeses for his brother's commander. He was a captain in Saul's army, married within months to the king's daughter Michal, and bound by sworn covenant to the king's son Jonathan. The court at Gibeah of Saul, the same fortified citadel north of Jerusalem the archaeologist W.F. Albright excavated as Tel el-Ful in the 1920s, was the world he now woke up in. The transition that had taken Joseph years in Egypt took David weeks in Israel, and almost from the first morning, Saul began to suspect that he had let into his household the man Samuel had warned him about. The catalyst was the song. The women of every town had met the returning army with the refrain that gave Saul his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And the arithmetic in the verse, a clear ratio of comparison, was not lost on the king. From that day on, the text in 1 Samuel 18 verse 9 says simply, Saul kept a close eye on David. The Hebrew verb is awan, to eye with suspicion. The dark spirit that David's harp had once calmed returned the next day. And Saul, raving, threw a spear at him as he played. The text says David eluded it. The text says it happened twice. The court began to learn that the young commander's life had become contingent on his own reflexes during music. Saul's strategy shifted from impulse to design. He had a daughter, Merab, and offered her to David in marriage on a single condition. Be valiant for me. Fight the Lord's battles. The condition was a trap. Saul's reasoning, reported by the narrator in 1 Samuel 18 verse 17, is one of the most cynical sentences in the whole biblical history. I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. Merab was given to another man in the end. But Saul's younger daughter, Michal, loved David. and the king saw a second opportunity. He demanded as the bride price not silver, which a shepherd's son could never afford, but 100 Philistine foreskin.